Welcome to New Detroit's Town Hall, Content and Conversations about Race. I am your host, Marcelle Montgomery Favors, Project Manager for New Detroit. New Detroit is a nonprofit organization that works to eliminate racism and create a more just society in metropolitan Detroit. To learn more about our mission and organization, please visit us online at newdetroit.org. Well, I have to say that we had an entirely different conversation planned for you today, and we decided to make a shift and have an organic conversation about racial and social inequities with our moderator and guest speaker today. Our moderator is Dr. Truman Hudson Jr., a social economist. He's an author, an educator, and community builder who co-designs programs for the University of Michigan Dearborn, Wayne State University, and Wayne County Community College District. Through his work at Wayne State University, Hudson is currently investigating youth perspectives on COVID-19 and social justice movements and how systems influence Black men's health. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Lester Spence, professor in political science and Africana studies at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Spence is an award-winning scholar, author, and teacher, has published 2 award-winning books, has over a dozen academic articles, and several dozen essays and think pieces. Please welcome Dr. Lester Spence and Dr. Truman Hudson Jr.
All right, well, Dr. Spence, it is indeed a pleasure to reconnect with you, my friend. Our history goes back a lot of years. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. Thank you for being an influential force in my life. I recall when you were going through your graduate studies at the University of Michigan, you gave this fair-haired youth at that time perspectives that helped me look at economics and business development through a different lens. So thank you for that opportunity to be in your short area of tutelage. As we surge in this conversation today, I think the 90s that was a great time in our lives. We had the economic boom during the Clinton era. We were literally coming out of Reaganomics and the Bush policies. And at that time, we saw a lot of investment in Black America through the academic and housing and economic development framing. We saw the empowerment zones take off around the country. And we saw a host of new Black leadership get established in our urban centers. And today, fast forward to today, we're in this COVID pandemic and we're under new leadership in the country and things are happening around the world. And just as a Black man, as a Black scholar, as a brother who's making moves, what's your perspectives on this transition that we've been through over the past almost 30 plus years?
So, you know, it's cool that you actually started with those Clinton years because I actually have a different take on it. So the original thing we were supposed to do is about basically about my research agenda as boiled down into like a short TED Talk clip, right? How the free market devastated Black communities. And what I basically talk about in that clip is how a specific set of ideas about public policy, about government, about business, about the individual as the entrepreneur end up generating a significant level of inequality, not just in general, but specifically within Black communities, right? Mm-hmm. So I'll talk real quickly about that Clinton moment. So during that Clinton moment, Clinton passed NAFTA, which significantly reduced the ability of labor to organize. It was under Clinton that welfare moved from being a right to a 5-year privilege with a whole host of like punitive sanctions on single mothers if they couldn't find work. It was under Clinton that that the number of people in federal prisons start to starkly increase. Although it's important to note that most prisoners are in state and local prisons, but still under it was Clinton that started that kind of federal impetus to sanction people for a range of crimes. It was under Clinton that we saw the financial sector really take hold of our nation, right? So if you think about growing up in Detroit, in and around Detroit, technically I grew up in Inkster, a number of us, black folk, we have family members who are able to make a middle class life, and more in some cases, by working in the automotive industry, right? And the manufacturing sector was a sector that pretty much dominated the American economy up until around 1970. And that sector is then gradually replaced with the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. It was under Clinton that the banking sector significantly deregulated, right? So and in fact, what you can do, you can also, we're talking about that federal stuff. We could also talk about the local stuff, right? Because Coleman Young decides not to run for a sixth term, and and Dennis Archer Sr. Actually replaces him, while Bill Clinton is instituting a number of policies at the top. And you notice, and you mentioned the empowerment zone, right? So Bill Clinton is the first president in a while to articulate an urban agenda, but that urban agenda is basically dominated by corporate interests. And in fact, even to the extent that government becomes involved, government is supposed to be disciplined by business. Right.
Like, wasn't that framework set up under Reagan, not Reagan years? And when we go back to Johnson administration and we look at the war on poverty, and we move from the war on poverty through the Ford and Carter era, where we move into this recession, and we deal with the OPEC oil crisis, and then when we get into the Reagan years, where we go into greater deregulation and more support for for-profit entities to do a lot of the work of the government. Wasn't that tone set during that era?
So the ideas for it go back to the 30s, right? The first time we see them implemented ideationally, that is their ideas in the world trying to take hold, is as a result of the oil crisis in 1970, right? And then Reagan starts to argue more forcefully for them. He institutes a set of tax policies that try to do that. It's under Reagan. Reagan basically significantly hurts the Pell Grant program, right? So it's under Reagan that happens, and Reagan shifts the set aside program between cities, states, and federal governments. Not the set aside is another term for it, but you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. But it's under Reagan is arguing for it from a Republican / conservative perspective. What we see with Clinton, and then locally with mayors like Archer, is we see them actually complete the term, right? Because at first it's primarily Republicans making this argument, making that argument, right? But when you get Clinton come into office, and then locally folks like Archer, you actually see the Democrats and the Republicans propose this stuff, right? Now, part of it is, to be fair, that Clinton and the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, a group of Southern governors who were tired of getting their butts kicked in elections, they're like, okay, what can we do to actually take some of the steam from our Republican counterparts, right? But part of it is that people believed in it, right? So the result of all this stuff is we end up really exacerbating, we end up creating and then exacerbating a two-tier economy. An economy where some people, people like us, whether they're Black or who have the ability through education to get good jobs with benefits and security, and they affirm our lives, they affirm our value. We're able to do that, and then there's this group of folks on the bottom who can't do it.
I agree, because when you go back to the Archer era, most of Archer's framework was focusing on bringing in the best and the brightest, and again, recruiting people outside and not really investing in the human capital that already existed in the city. And at the same time, we saw us shifting from that manufacturing model into, as you stated, this new FIRE model, which required a higher level of expertise, which oftentimes wasn't in our center cities.
Yeah. So if you think about it, one of the first things he wanted to do was he argued for TQM, total quality management. Total quality management was an MBA philosophy articulated by, I want to say either GE or GM's, one of GE's or GM's executives, right? And the whole idea was reinventing government at the local level. And it's important to note that as he's doing it at the local level, Al Gore's talking about reinventing government at the national level, at the federal level, right? And it's the same idea. You take this business model and you run government like a business. So rather than citizens, we become consumers, right? So it's all these metrics that are used to kind of judge how government performs, and then it's all these ways to cut government costs, because the idea is that government shouldn't be kind of big trying to do everything. It should be really, really small and tight and just do a few things well, and then let the entrepreneurial sector actually bloom. And what that tends to do, what that did nationally and what that did locally, and we could actually see it, right? What that did was it created a dynamic where you had a group of really stark haves and a really stark have-not. You could no longer graduate from Henry Ford High School, for example, and do nothing other than that, but still be able to get a job in a plant and buy a crib somewhere, Rosedale Park or somewhere, and be able to take care of your family. That was a wrap. After that, and it's deep, because the best thing, Archer didn't want to do this, but you can even read the casinos as part of this dynamic. It's like, okay, the manufacturing sector has gone out, but we need these folk with jobs. What can we do? And then you bring in the casino, which is, almost the opposite of a business like Ford. At least Ford generated products, right? The casinos are solely extractive, right? You go in, the way they make money is by taking yours. Right. Not taking yours and giving you giving you an object in return, but taking yours. And as an aside, I know we're gonna bring this back to the NBA because it's directly related to the police function in major American cities, and then it's kind of related to the pushback.
Yeah, and I appreciate your pushback, because where I was going is that the GDP was doing well. So the GDP and the GNP, we're looking well on the national and the international scene. But locally, on the ground, our communities didn't do as well. And we saw major disinvestment. As you stated, most of the investment went into the corporate model. Most investment went into all of these business ideologies that were to, quote unquote, right size the economy.
Yeah, that's right.
With that, as we move from this era and we go into the Bush era, and there's allegedly this digital divide that no longer exists. So during the Clinton era, there was a big push around making sure that there was technologies available for people in the rural and urban centers who traditionally would not have access. And during the Bush administration, they issued a report that stated that pretty much there is no digital divide, that the people in the urban and rural centers had access to technologies through the Xbox and all these other tools. Not real technologies, but they had access to technologies.
Yeah.
And if we fast forward to today and we look at what happened in March, and in March of this year, when the pandemic started to decimate our urban centers, and we saw the numbers go up, and we tried to continue our education in our urban spaces and even in our rural spaces, it was apparent that the technologies weren't there.
Yeah.
So going back to, I think, in building on your framework around neoliberalism and inequalities, there were these inequities that were inherent to the system that even goes back as far back to 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, where these systems have been put into place. And it appears that no matter what the policies are, you can never get it right, because this level of oppression exists that prevents individuals from traditionally underrepresented communities to move up the ladder. Can you expound on that and what you saw in that shift between between the Bush era and where we are today?
Yeah, so one of the dynamics that ends up happening with that turn is, and this is cool because I didn't talk about this really in the video clip at all, but I talk about this a lot more in the book, is that you actually have this idea that education, which is supposed to be a public good, regulated by the states, that education becomes privatized, right? And first of all, it's, you know, a matter of getting individuals to think of private school as a legitimate option to public school. And it's deep because now for folks like us, there are only a few people like us who send their kids routinely to public school. Private school is now kind of the default model where growing up, it had become the default model. So to be fair, I went to Sacred Heart 6th to 8th grade. That's how I know Marshall. And then I went to Bishop Borges, that doesn't exist anymore, 9th through 12th grade. But our generation was the first generation for whom even like a working class Catholic school became like a model. And that was because resources were being peeled out of education, in part because education is based on property taxes, right? But then there's this privatizing where you take public schools and make them private. So the introduction of vouchers, for example, where you give an individual a certain amount of money and you give that individual the ability to spend that money in the form of tax dollars and give that to somebody else, right? That's one thing. That didn't really take hold a lot, but you still see elements of it in Detroit. But what really took hold was, particularly after kind of a set of artificially generated crises, was charter schools, right? Where you actually say, okay, we're going to actually create these school system, this school system model where each individual school is kind of run like a franchise, and then they're significantly deregulated. Like some regulations they have to follow, but a lot of them they don't. And then parents, those schools compete against each other for kids and for their parents. And then the parents act like the consumer, looking at all these different choices to see what choice actually fits their kids the most. Choice becomes kind of a key word, right? Mm-hmm. And what we do in that moment is we really lose this sense of education being a public, community-based good. I used to joke, so the first gig I had before I came to Baltimore was in St. Louis. And I remember I was at Michigan playing basketball. There used to be a Saturday morning game that I would play in. And I was talking with one of the guys who was playing, and I was telling him I was going to St. Louis. And I was like, and he was like, man, they do this weird thing in St. Louis. I'm like, what? He was like, if you ever talk to one of them, the first thing they're going to do is ask you what high school you went to. And I used to think that was so weird until I realized that anytime we would meet somebody around our age in the city or who said they were from Detroit, the first thing we would ask them is what high school they went to.
And why do you think that is? Because that's sometimes when I talk to people that are from outside of the city, they acknowledge like, wow, it's hard for me to even engage in conversation because if I can't establish myself from a local high school, I'm really out of the loop in Detroit.
Yeah, right. And what that is, and they do this here in Baltimore too. What that is, it establishes you in a geographic location, and then through that location into kind of like a class identity, right? So we know what you were about if you said you went to Cooley. We know what you were about if you said you went to Kettering, right? At least in that case, like for example, you know if you went to Kettering, you're an East Sider. If you went to Cooley, you're a West Sider, right? But once you actually put that charter school dynamic in the mix, then you could live anywhere, right? And then all of a sudden, again, the concept of education as a public good for everybody, it ends up being fraught because now it's just individuals making choices. And what that ends up doing is significantly exacerbating inequalities within both in the state as a whole, in the region, and because, you know, for the most part, it's like cities like Detroit, Inkster, Highland Park, it's basically all the majority black cities and a few poor white ones that are dealing with this charter school type dynamic, that are dealing with this type of experimentation, this neoliberal experimentation. Everybody else is good, right? And that exacerbates gaps between the region and then exacerbates gaps within the region because there are parents who have the ability to make all those choices, to do all that driving around, to take the kids wherever they need to go. And then on top of that, if they're not able to get their kid in the cast, they can pay the money to send their kid to Country Day with no problem. right?
Economic and social capital, so they have mobility.
They have mobility, right? And everybody else is deeply locked in. So what we see with the pandemic is all those inequalities which already existed, but because of a number of different forces, including kind of popular culture forces, we kind of disappeared. And then all of a sudden, it all comes up. The essential worker is basically the brother or the sister who would have worked in the Detroit context, who would have worked in Ford if this was 1966.
Right, and even when we look at that conversation about essential workers, I think we need to reframe that discussion, because it became more of a white framework, that the essential worker was the doctor or the nurse.
Yeah.
So it became a class issue, but it also became a cultural dynamic. And it's funny because my mother is a certified medical assistant, 45 years, retired from DMC. And we had this discussion, and she said, they miss the people that actually make it happen. The janitors, the maintenance people, the receptionists, the certified nursing assistants, the DINAs, the STEMNAs, all of these people, the dietary aides, the people that keep the system moving. There's no conversation around them. And then when you look at Black unemployment during the pandemic, it skyrocketed. And as of the latest report, it's at 15.7%. So, and going back to your discussion around neoliberalism and the policies, have the policies really benefited when we look at the laissez-faire market framework of the people that it's supposed to benefit?
Well, the thing is the people it was supposed to benefit were the people who developed their human capital. Right? The whole idea of human capital is a neoliberal framework. It's introduced by Gary Beckett at the University of Chicago, right? And his whole thing is we are individuals who kind of develop our own human capital, and we develop it, and in exchange for us developing our human capital, we get that back in the form of a wage. And the more work we do to develop our human capital, the better, the more resources we get, and the more resources we should get, right? So one argument would be that the people who get the bulk of the resources now are the people who are supposed to get it. Right, but we have a different, more capacious understanding because we're Democrats with a small d, and we love Black people with a capital B. We believe that the people who should get it are the people, not you because you went to Country Day or because because you graduated from Michigan, like in my case, right? I mean that's what we're fighting. So to bring it back to Jacob Blake, or better yet. Jacob Blake and George Floyd, right? It's interesting because when I was trying to read up on Jacob Blake, what they talk about is what they say is that he moved to Kenosha to make a new start. So the implication there is that he kind of lost his way and he was back in Kenosha kind of to make a new start. That reads to me when I read that reads to me like he was a working class guy, right? George Floyd had two jobs. He worked as a bouncer and as a truck driver. He was positive for COVID. So bringing the policing dynamic into it, once you've got an economy that's really geared towards a very thin slice of an area like Detroit or Baltimore, where those cities can be plausibly argued plausibly posited as functioning, even though you've got this large body of folk that's unemployed, right? Once you do that, you need some type of force to socially control them. And that's how police function. So you look at Kenosha, the first thing I looked at was what that police budget was. And I can't tell you the number, but what I can tell you is the percentage. Kenosha, they spend 24% of their municipal revenue on policing. That's the highest of any line item, right? Detroit's actually an interesting case because Detroit's still coming up from under bankruptcy. But Detroit still spends a significant and inordinate amount of money on policing, and again, it's that social control function. And when we talk about social control, real quickly, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we talk about it as if it is purely a racial dynamic, and it is not. Black, yeah, right. It's race and it's economics and it's gender. It's the three of them together, right? You're talking about the victims of police murders are disproportionately poor and lower income black men. Right. So when we're fighting, so it's one of the things I love about this movement is that for the first time we're putting basically lower income folk at the forefront of what we're struggling for. But one of the challenges I have is that we're not, because we're focused so much on policing, which we should be, we're not focusing on those larger labor issues, the thing that generates, that makes and one final thing about the essential worker is funny. So I'm working at Hopkins, and once everything happens, right, it's like we have to move our stuff out. And the last day we had to move our stuff out, one of my colleagues, an Indian anthropologist, that is an anthropologist from India, she was talking to one of the janitors in the building. And you know the janitorial staff at Hopkins, you know what they look like, even though you haven't been there. They're all black, just like all the landscapers are Latino, right? So she's talking to those janitors, and the janitors are like, yeah, Hopkins basically told us we were essential workers, so we can't take time off. We can't, they haven't even given us masks or any equipment yet. Like nothing. It's like, no, this is, and so that's the reason why they're the ones that are policed. And that's the reason why they're the ones that are prematurely dying. Even though in that case, it's complicated because, you and I, we've already lost a number of fraternity brothers through it.
Right.
Yeah.
And when we look at that loss, and if we juxtapose it against the historical context of black movements, in this country, and if we were to look at the so-called quote-unquote talented 10th, and if we were to frame it from the talented 10th and look at entertainers like Paul Robeson, who not only tried to attack the issues around race and inequalities in this country from a national and international perspective, and then the brothers who raised their fist at the 68 Olympics. And then we move into Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's, and then today with the NBA and the NFL getting behind something that they should have got behind when Colin Kaepernick first brought it to their attention almost 4 years ago to the date. That Black lives do matter, and that we need to look at this a little differently. Our entertainers have started to invest a lot more in the community, i.e. LeBron with his charter school, or with the public school that he's investing in, and trying to get other people to invest in that public school model.
Jalen here in Detroit. I'm sorry, Jalen there in Detroit.
That's with a charter school.
Oh yeah, that's right.
He's taking it through the charter school movement, and then LeBron with the public school movement.
That's right.
Both of them see the power of investing in education and utilizing their celebrity to help advance a greater agenda. So when we go back to what happened yesterday with the Milwaukee Bucks and then the Detroit Lions and other teams following, and even the WNBA, how do we frame and support them in looking at this beyond, as you stated, just race, and really helping them to start to see the race, the economics, and gender, and moving towards an agenda so it doesn't get stuck on defunding the police?
So first, it's funny. So my first book was on rap and black politics. And what I really wanted to do with that book was kind of actually make a critique of how black popular culture was functioning in that moment. Whether you're talking about the lyrics of MCs, whether you're talking about kind of the actions of quote unquote hip hop entrepreneurs like Russell Simmons, or whether you're talking about elected officials. Like I had a chapter in there about Kwame, right? But what I did and what I didn't do, what I wanted to do in that book was make a critique. But what I wish I could have done a little bit more of is really talk about how black popular culture can, not all the time, but can and has worked historically to reorient our ideas about what it means to be American, to reorient our ideas about what it means to be black in a way where where we see ourselves in people like George Floyd and like Breonna Taylor, right? And what we've seen, and I have to give a shout out to another Detroiter, Earl Henderson, who grew up in the Brewster's Projects, graduated from Cass Tech, and I think in probably like 77 77 or 78, then got his PhD at University of Michigan. He's been the one who's been doing the most work on this, right? Because he's got this idea about kind of how cultural revolutions function, right? Because you think about black people have little political power. We have political power about the size of our numbers, right? And it's coming close to it because of the Voting Rights Act. It's complicated because in a lot of cases we're like in the cities like Detroit, we're capturing hollow prizes, but still we got about as much political power as our numbers. We have a less economic power as our numbers because of the legacy because of slavery, then Jim Crow, then the effects of industrialization and deindustrialization. But in the cultural arena, we actually have power outside of our numbers, right? So maybe we're like 15% of the population. American popular culture is synonymous with black people now. Right. So it's in that cultural arena that we actually have our most purchase, right? So you mentioned Paul Robeson. You could talk about Harry Belafonte. You could talk about Sidney Poitier. You could talk about Aretha Franklin, right? So you have all these individuals, right? The playwright who passed away when she was barely 30. Damn it, the sister. It'll come to me. But there are all these folk, and what you see them doing is a few different things.
Nora Hurst.
No, not Zora Neale Hurston. Playwright. Used to be cool with James Baldwin. Lorraine Hansberry. Okay. Lorraine Hansberry. Yeah. So what you see them doing, James Baldwin, what you see them doing is a couple of different things, right? One is the money that they're getting from their cultural production, they're putting directly into the movement, right? Like a big chunk of the civil rights movement is funded from Harry Belafonte's work. John Coltrane performed at least more than one jazz concert for them. So you see it, it's a cash thing. We get money for this, we give it to you. But the other thing is ideational, right? So what they're doing with their work is they're promoting through their culture these different visions of what it means to be black and then what it means to be American, right? And then they're also through their work critiquing existing institutions, proposing new institutions. And then that ends up working alongside social movements to create the capacity for those movements to transform the nation politically, economically, and culturally. Now, again, it doesn't always work that way. We can simultaneously suggest that Michael Jordan helps make the NBA a global brand. Michael Jordan helps make a certain vision of black manhood acceptable in the nation, while totally crapping on the idea that he had any political responsibility whatsoever, right?
Or any political clout. Do you think he believes that he has the clout?
I think the best argument I can make for him was, I was a basketball player. I was more committed to beating Isaiah Thomas, which he only did once. He only did it once. Vic is like 3-1. You gotta say that. But his best argument was I was a basketball player and I wanted to be the best at this. Human capital. I wanted to develop my human capital for this. But at the same time, we've got other forces, right? And what we have in this moment is we have that coming back, where first you could probably, you look at Black Lives Matter, and then you actually can look at social media itself as like a form of kind of like culture production. And one of the biggest problems for years was that while blacks were cultural creators, we were America's first cultural creators, we didn't have control of the means of production, right? We just couldn't because we didn't have the loot. Right, like Delta Sigma Theta attempted to create, I think, their own movie production company, I think, in the early 70s, but it failed because they couldn't compete with Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood was Hollywood, right? But with the introduction of this specific technological shift, it now becomes possible for black folk to generate content. Like, this is what we're doing now. So we do this, and then we've got this, that helps generate a movement. Then the movement ends up peeling back and then informing what cultural producers are doing. And then it becomes deep because now it's possible for a black cultural producer to become a billionaire.
Right.
So Oprah's a billionaire. Jay-Z and Beyonce are close to billionaires individually, but definitely as a couple. Dre is a billionaire. Combs is about to be a billionaire. Bob Johnson is a billionaire off of BET, right? So he's not a cultural producer, but it still is off of a cultural production. Jordan's a billionaire. Tiger Woods and LeBron James are on their way. So on the one hand, it's complicated because on the one hand, billionaires don't normally get involved in politics on the side of working class men and women. They may say they do that.
Right, but they primarily work with institutions.
They primarily work with institutions through, if they do anything, is through philanthropy. Right? Like I would take, and to be fair, that's as much a tax dynamic where it protects their money from being taxed as it is them helping.
Right.
But what we see with LeBron James and them is them saying, you know what, this money stuff doesn't matter, right? I'm willing, it's not just, LeBron James wants to be the best basketball player ever. The predominant way he does that, the only way he can get to the point, I already think he's better than anybody except Kareem, but the only way he really gets past Jordan is by winning championships because he's lost so many. He's willing to, and he's old. He's willing to say, you know what? Scrap the season. Giannis, the Greek freak, plays for the Milwaukee Bucks. Just got Defensive Player of the Year, right? Baller. He's willing to say, you know what? Nah, that's okay. I'm out. Osaka, the tennis player. She was in the semifinals of the Western and Southern Classic, was supposed to be played today. She's like, you know what? Nah, that's okay. This is the thing. This is the thing that they're actually. This is why they do what they do. You know,
how do we move them past taking a position where it's a public stance to building more capital where they can make greater impacts? Because I think, going back to the history of our movements in this country, again, Black entertainers have been a part of trying to make a difference in civil rights in America.
Yeah.
But it feels kind of like piecemeal because there's nobody bringing it all together to say, let's make this happen.
So what we have to take into account of in moments like this is the long durée of struggle. So 6 years ago, Donald Sterling was caught on tape with his mistress making a number of racist comments. Don Sterling, for those that don't know, used to own the LA Clippers. So those statements got out, and then Chris Paul, who was the best player of the LA Clippers at the time, was like, you know what, I think we're not going to play because this guy needs to go. Now, the deep thing about Donald Sterling and Bomani Jones, a dope-ass sports columnist, works for ESPN, he's been writing about this a long time. Donald Sterling was a racist slum landlord. He had lost several racial discrimination cases. Before this happened, people knew. So it wasn't like he all of a sudden, it was just that this public instance of racism generated the thing. So we can argue at that moment that, you know what? In fact, I did. I was like, this is dope, but it would have been kind of cool had they done this about the more important stuff, not him basically calling Magic Johnson, out of his name. But it's small steps. We went so long where the number of Black popular culture figures engaging in politics was so small that we actually needed this dynamic to help generate. So it's the LA Clippers in 2014. It's Colin Kaepernick in 2016. Yep, I think in a year before that, a year after that, is the University of Missouri football players deciding that they're not going to play until their president leaves, right? So it's all these small things that are building. So one of the things I appreciate LeBron James for, among other things, is he's actually organizing to make sure Black people vote. right? He's actually putting money in something that they're probably still trying to figure it out. Because again, he is a basketball player, right? He's probably outsourced this to his people to figure out what this institution is going to look like. That's going to be about making sure black folk are able to get the vote. I know he wanted to pay money for folk in Florida, because once Florida passed Amendment 4, which gives felons the right to vote, the racist legislature then said, well, no, you can't vote unless you pay all your fees. Yeah. So James was like, you know what? I will put a big chunk of money into paying fees. So there are...
Jim Crow?
Huh?
You said the new Jim Crow?
Yeah. That's usually I don't like that language, but that's the one point, that's the one space where it's actually appropriate. That's the one space where I think is actually appropriate, right? So we've got these attempts, and you're right, they need to be lashed up. But I don't talk about hope. I don't talk about being hopeful. I don't believe in that stuff. But what I do know is that I believe in development change over time. And what we're seeing now actually increases the odds that we're going to see this stuff be more concretized. I will say, I mean, hell, I'm a Baltimore guy. I now lived here long enough where I claim Baltimore home, just like I claim Detroit as home. I have all types of problems with DeRay McKesson. The activist, he made his name in Ferguson, but he's a Baltimore guy, and I think he's still around here. From what I understand, whenever he'd end up going to the joint, it'd be Beyonce's people who got him out. Mm. And I've got all types of critiques of Beyonce and Jay-Z, massive ones. But I mean, that's saying that there's stuff going on privately. I think the way we're moving, these things are going to be lashed up sooner rather than later.
But soon enough to get the millennials engaged, because I'm on some threads right now. Yeah. Where there are people from the millennial generation who feel like, why vote? I don't feel like my vote matters. Yeah. And then there are a group of people that are really tied, especially in this campaign season, tied to Bernie Sanders, and they feel like the Democrats really aren't going to carry the agenda forward that they are looking for to actually make change in America. So they're going to actually sit out, from what I heard on various threads. So how does a Get Out the Vote campaign work to actually bring in those people to connect to the political engine of the country?
I gave money to Bernie Sanders, and I was kind of sort of involved in an attempt to get black academics to generate black left support for Sanders. Mm-hmm. I gave money to Warren too, but I really gave money to Sanders. Was really the person I wanted to win. So I have to say that I don't think that's going to be real. I think there are a whole bunch of people who are pissed. For me, Biden and Harris was the worst. Biden, Harris on one hand, and Bloomberg on the others. Those are the three worst candidates to me. I didn't want a Biden-Harris ticket at all because of their history and crime, and because their support for those Clinton kind of politics that got us in trouble in the first place. Right. With that said, I think that when it comes down to it, like, a whole bunch of people are going to be pissed, but then a whole bunch of people are going to go to polls. The percentage of people who don't go to the polls because they're upset this time around will be far smaller than the percentage of people in Detroit who couldn't vote because of basically voter suppression, which which folk don't talk about in general, but we all know that those long wait lines in a number of polls, in a number of polls in the city, combined with Clinton not wanting to do no campaigning in Detroit and the state of Michigan at all because she thought she had it in the bag. Those are far bigger issues than younger folk expressing frustration, which is legitimate. I think the vast majority of those folk are going to end up being in the polls. The trick is articulating the vote, though, as part of a larger suite of action, right? Because if we think about it, with the other thing, the NBA, and it's the NBA, it's the Major League Baseball League, the Major League Soccer canceled its games, right? I mean, so it's
NBA too.
Yeah. WNBA, it's. I mean, you got white people in Troy. That's when I knew we were looking at something different. White people in
right. When I looked out my window, I'm in Midtown, and I could look out to Woodward Avenue. And when I started seeing movements of people that didn't look like me protesting for weeks on end, I'm like, something is happening.
right? And I mean, that's powerful. That's popular culture working, right? We can't vote our way into police reform. Like voting is not going to be, in part, largely because the police, like education, the police are a state and city function, right? So we can't Congress and Senate our way to all this stuff. Like, I love Rashida Tlaib. I'm so glad she represents my parents. Like, I claim her as my representative, even though I live 578 miles away. But Rashida Tlaib can't do anything about this. This is a state dynamic. Right? So what we have to do is get folks to understand that vote, but we have to understand a whole other suite of policies, including disruptive protest, which is what this general strike is. Like, what they basically did was an old school 60s era labor strike and say, you know what, we're not coming back until this issue is taken care of. That type of thing generates change. We saw that. The three of us were kids. We grew up where the Confederacy was normal. I used to watch Dukes of Hazzard every Friday. Did you ever think that the state of Mississippi would change their flag because basically a large group of college football players were like, you know what? Y'all take down this flag and we're not playing.
In our lifetime.
In our lifetime. I knew Obama would be the first black president. I didn't really like him all that much, but I knew he'd be the first black president. There are all these things that I knew would come. I never thought that we got monuments outside of Hopkins. They took those down with the quickness. Like, that's basically black popular culture in working alongside and within and outside of black social movements. That's how that happens. So quickly, if we reify the vote, we miss all that.
So then if I think there's a powerful movement occurring in the NCAA as well, because now the athletes actually own their rights to their own images.
Yeah. Can
you speak to how your college athletes can actually get engaged in movements and making a difference?
So I'm currently in a struggle with other colleagues at Hopkins. I think we won, but Hopkins wanted to implement its own police force. This is like just a couple of years after the Freddie Gray uprising. They want to implement their own police force, and we knew that would be problematic. So we've been working. Hopkins is only D1 in lacrosse, but I'd imagine, even though we've been able to be successful, if the Hopkins lacrosse players, which is what generates a big chunk of Hopkins donor revenue, if the Hopkins lacrosse players were like, yeah, no, this isn't happening unless you do this, that's going to generate all types of change. So what we see with college athletes increasingly is a two-pronged dynamic. One is they recognize their status as laborers, and they believe as laborers they have certain rights, but then they understand their status as culture workers promoting a certain vision of the university, and that also gives them a certain amount of power. The primary reason I wanted to go to the University of Michigan and end up going was because of their football team, right? Like I made a Michigan State choice for reasons I don't even understand. Like a really young in my life. It wasn't the fact that they were known for academics. It wasn't. No, it was football. I remember one of my friends who was in the PhD program with me. She was like, yeah, the reason I chose Michigan was because of the Fab Five. Like, she's getting a PhD in political science. Michigan was the best in the nation in political science at the time. But it wasn't Michigan being number one in political science. It was Chris Webber and them. So they're recognizing that power, and they're actually working they're working to exemplify. The question is, again, it's still going to be, though, it's about lashing it up to institutions, and then it's about getting them to recognize that labor worker dynamic, because it's not. I mean, Breonna Taylor was like an emergency medical technician. Ahmaud Arbery wanted to be an electrician, but he had to drop out of school because he didn't have a loot. Like Freddie Gray, if he didn't get killed by police, he most likely would have died from lead poisoning because he was exposed to lead poisoning at an early age. So how do you actually deal with those type of, and again, we're gonna, by the time the election rolls around, we would have lost almost as many deaths to COVID as we lost in World War II.
Well, as we get ready, Brother Dr. Spence, this is a powerful conversation.
Man, this was too short. I knew this was good. This would go quick, man. Damn.
You laid out some good stuff.
This is dope.
And when we talked about school choice and we talked about class identity, you gave us a potential pathway forward in looking at politics more locally and moving away from this national perspective and looking for the national government to come in and save the day. And with that, when you extended the conversation around the Black Lives Matter movement being beyond race, but also incorporating this discussion around economics and gender, is something that us economists can try and quantify the impacts of how does race, gender, and economics play into the inequalities in this country. And I think what I walked away with most is that there is a movement afoot with the pop culture, and it's up to us to help the pop culture, people like you and I, to not only know that they already know that they have power, but to kind of like bring that power in and do something that is more demonstrative and making an impact in their culture production. Do you have any last words you want to share with us before we close out, Good Dot?
This is wonderful. Again, I claim Baltimore's home, but anytime I get a chance to speak to my folk in Detroit, it's really important to think about. In fact, in this moment, coming back to the history of New Detroit as being the creation of kind of an outgrowth of the '67 rebellion, it's really important to remember that, right? Because it's organizations like New Detroit which can help us forge a more powerful identity that can basically return the city to the people who like live in it, as opposed to the forces of capital that own it. And then one more thing, given that I've known the both of you, like I think I've known Marshall for almost 40 years. I've known you for approximately 30. Friendship really is essential to the soul. I love the both of you and appreciate you.
Amen, brother. Thank you. And I appreciate you as well. Looking forward to connecting with you on house music, discussions around politics, and also, as you stated, thank you, New Detroit, for this conversation. We're looking forward to New Detroit continuing to lead this discussion and move a different agenda, not only in Detroit, but around the nation.